What happened to those who collaborated with the Nazis? Between 1944 and 1951, France investigated approximately 300,000 cases of collaboration with Nazi Germany. More than 6,700 people were sentenced to death, though fewer than 800 executions were actually carried out. But before the courts opened their doors, another purge had already begun. The épuration sauvage, the wild purge, claimed an estimated 10,000 lives through extrajudicial executions and public humiliation. Here is the central tension of France's reckoning: the wild purge killed roughly 10,000 people without trial. The legal purge that followed investigated 300,000 cases, pronounced 6,700 death sentences, yet executed fewer than 800. The courts, in other words, executed 1/10 the number killed by mob violence. From the moment Allied forces landed in Normandy, the fate of collaborators was sealed. They would not face merely legal judgment, but popular rage. They were beaten in the streets, their heads shaved in public squares, and executed without trial. Why was the treatment of these accused collaborators so swift and brutal? What role did the resistance play in this wave of revenge? And why, after surviving this ordeal, were many quickly pardoned and returned to positions of influence? But to understand France's purge, we must move beyond the simple story of heroes and villains. We must enter the grey zone. August 1944, the summer of reckoning. The afternoon of August 16, 1944, marked a moment France had awaited for long years. Allied forces were advancing rapidly through Normandy. Town after town, village after village fell from German control. But liberation brought not only joy, but fury. As the occupiers retreated, another enemy emerged from the shadows: the collaborators. But who exactly were the collaborators? The word conjures images of fascist ideologues and Gestapo informers. These existed, certainly. But they were the extremes. The reality was far more complex and far more troubling. Most of the 300,000 people who would face investigation were neither heroes nor monsters. They were the bank teller who processed German accounts to feed his family, the railway worker who repaired locomotives knowing they carried supplies to the Wehrmacht, the mayor who implemented Vichy agricultural quotas, the factory foreman who kept production running under German contracts. Were these people collaborators? Or were they survivors making impossible choices under occupation? This question, more than any other, would define the purge and haunt French memory for generations. In the town square of Chartres, a woman sat bound to a wooden chair. Around her, a crowd gathered, jeering, shouting, demanding justice. A man approached with scissors. What followed would become one of the most iconic and disturbing images of the liberation. The taunt, the head shaving. Her crime: collaboration horizontal collaboration. She had maintained a relationship with a German soldier. Was she an informer who had betrayed resistors to the Gestapo? A profiteer who had grown rich from German patronage? Or was she a 19-year-old woman who had fallen in love with the wrong person in the wrong time? The scene repeated itself across France. In Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and countless smaller towns. By the end of summer 1944, approximately 20,000 women had undergone this ritual humiliation. Their heads shaved, sometimes stripped naked, paraded through streets while crowds spat and threw refuse. Contemporary photographs captured these moments. Images that would haunt French memory for generations. But the shaving of women was merely the most visible manifestation of a broader phenomenon. The épuration sauvage, the wild purge. A spontaneous, uncontrolled wave of retribution that swept through liberated France like wildfire. In the countryside of Dordogne, suspected collaborators were dragged from their homes at night. Some were beaten, others shot on the spot. In Lyon, members of the Milice, the Vichy paramilitary force that had hunted resistance fighters, were executed in the streets. Their bodies left as warnings. In Marseille, black market profiteers who had grown rich selling to the Germans were found floating in the harbour. Between June and December 1944, an estimated 10,000 people died in these extrajudicial killings. The exact number remains uncertain. The chaotic nature of liberation meant many deaths went unrecorded, bodies buried in unmarked graves, victims simply disappeared. Who were the executioners? Primarily members of the French resistance, particularly communist-aligned groups. For 4 years, these men and women had fought in the shadows. They had watched neighbors grow rich through collaboration while they risked torture and death. They had seen friends arrested, deported, executed. Now, with weapons in hand and an authority vacuum, they became judges and executioners. A survivor of the liberation in Tulle later recalled, the resistance arrived before the regular army. They had lists. Names of collaborators, informers, milice members. That first night, we heard gunshots throughout the town. By morning, bodies hung from lampposts. No trials, no defense. Just execution. The violence was not random but targeted. Milice members and known informers faced the greatest danger. Those who had denounced Jews or resistance members to the Gestapo were shown no mercy. But the lines blurred quickly. Factory owners who had profited from German contracts, police officers who had arrested resistors, mayors who had implemented Vichy policies, all became targets. Yet the purge also claimed those who existed in the grey zone. The police officer who had arrested black marketeers but also, under orders, arrested a resistor. The factory owner who had fulfilled German contracts but had also employed resistance members and sabotaged production runs. The mayor who had hidden Jews in his town hall cellar while publicly implementing Vichy's anti-Semitic census requirements. In the chaos of liberation, personal vendettas masqueraded as justice. A jealous husband could denounce a romantic rival as a collaborator. A business competitor could settle old scores through accusations of black market dealings. The absence of due process meant the innocent had no protection from the vengeful. The treatment of women accused of horizontal collaboration revealed the deeply gendered nature of the purge. While male collaborators faced execution or imprisonment for their actions, women were punished symbolically for their sexuality. The public head shaving served as a ritualized purification. France, portrayed as a woman violated by German occupation, was cleansing itself by punishing those women seen as having voluntarily submitted to the invader. A resistor who participated in these public shamings later reflected with discomfort, "We told ourselves we were purging France of corruption. But looking back, what we did to those women, the humiliation, the sexual violence of stripping them naked, it wasn't justice. It was something darker." In Paris, the liberation brought its own particular drama. As German forces withdrew in late August, resistance cells emerged from hiding. The city's wealthy collaborators, those who had attended glittering parties at German headquarters, who had dined with Nazi officers, suddenly found themselves hunted. Some fled, others barricaded themselves in their apartments, a few committed suicide rather than face popular judgment. The scale of the chaos alarmed Charles de Gaulle and the Provisional Government of the French Republic, the GPRF. De Gaulle recognized that unchecked violence threatened not just individual collaborators, but France's international legitimacy. If France appeared unable to control mob justice, how could it claim to be a functioning state worthy of Allied recognition? Yet de Gaulle faced a profound dilemma. The resistance, particularly its communist elements, had been instrumental in liberating French territory. These groups commanded loyalty, weapons, and popular support. Any attempt to curtail their power risked civil conflict. Moreover, de Gaulle needed the resistance's legitimacy to bolster his own claim to leadership. He had spent the war in exile. The resistors had bled on French soil. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda eagerly seized on reports of the Epuration Sauvage. German newspapers published exaggerated accounts claiming 9,000 summary executions in Paris alone, portraying the resistance as bloodthirsty communists butchering innocent civilians. These reports, though wildly inflated, served German purposes, attempting to delegitimize the liberation and sow fear in territories still under occupation. American and British newspapers also carried reports of the violence, though more measured. A British correspondent in Lyon wrote, "The scenes we witnessed were disturbing. Justice, if it can be called that, was meted out instantly and violently. The French people, so long oppressed, have become oppressors themselves, though one understands the fury that drives them." By autumn 1944, the situation reached a critical juncture. The wild purge was subsiding as German forces retreated further east and as Allied military government established control. But the question remained unanswered. How would France deal with collaboration? Through continued mob justice? Through forgetting and moving on? Or through a systematic legal process? The answer would determine not just the fate of accused collaborators, but the nature of postwar France itself. Would the Republic emerge from war governed by law or by revenge? And who had the authority to judge? To understand what came next, we must step back. Not to 1944, but to August 18, 1943. The location, Algiers, French Algeria. While metropolitan France still groaned under German occupation and Vichy rule, de Gaulle's provisional government was already planning for the aftermath. In a secure conference room, legal experts, former judges, and government officials gathered. Their task: create a legal framework for judging collaboration. The challenge was immense. How do you prosecute crimes that were technically legal under the governing regime? Vichy had been France's government, recognized initially by most nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Its laws were official. Collaboration with Germany was state policy. Implementing Vichy directives was, for 4 years, what French civil servants did. But was Vichy ever truly legitimate? The solution de Gaulle's government devised was not simply a legal fiction, but a restoration of republican legality. They argued that Vichy had been illegal from its inception. That the Act of June 10, 1940, which granted Pétain full powers, had violated the fundamental constitutional principles of the Third Republic. The argument went like this: national sovereignty, under republican law, is indivisible and inalienable. It cannot be transferred or surrendered. When the National Assembly voted to grant Pétain full powers, effectively dissolving the Republic, that vote itself was unconstitutional. The Assembly had no authority to end the Republic. Therefore, Vichy had never been legally valid. The true continuity of the French Republic, the GPRF claimed, ran through de Gaulle's Free French government in exile, not through the regime at Vichy. This wasn't merely a political claim. It was the essential legal premise that would allow a republic governed by law, not just by revolutionary anger, to prosecute collaborators. Henri Donadieu de Webers, a distinguished jurist who would later serve as French judge at Nuremberg, articulated the philosophical stakes: we face a unique challenge. We must demonstrate that the Republic never died, that Vichy was an illegal usurpation from the start. Only then can we prosecute collaboration not as a retroactive punishment, but as the enforcement of laws that Vichy never had the authority to suspend. This legal architecture solved one problem but created another. If Vichy was illegitimate from the start, its officials and supporters could be prosecuted for their service to an illegal regime. But what about the millions who had simply lived under Vichy, who had followed its laws because they were the laws? The solution was the creation of a new offense, indignite national unworthiness. This crime, formalized in an ordinance dated August 26, 1944, just days after Paris's liberation, was specifically designed to capture collaboration's moral dimension while avoiding the appearance of purely retroactive punishment. The ordinance stated, national unworthiness consists of having, between June 16, 1940 and the complete liberation of the territory, aided Germany or her allies or harmed the unity of the nation, the liberty of the French, or the equality among them. This expansive definition meant almost any form of active cooperation with Vichy or the occupiers could potentially constitute indignite national. The penalties ranged from loss of civil rights and confiscation of property to prison terms. Crucially, it was designed to capture the grey zone, the vast middle ground between outright treason and mere survival. General Pierre Koenig, military governor of Paris, received orders to establish the judicial machinery. 3 tiers of courts would handle the purge, each designed to address different levels of collaboration. The High Court would try members of Vichy's government, ministers, and senior officials who had held state power. Courts of justice would handle serious collaborators, those accused of actively aiding the enemy or committing acts against the resistance. Finally, civic courts would adjudicate cases of indignite national, the lesser but far more numerous offenses. The creation of this legal architecture represented a calculated gamble. De Gaulle needed to channel the resistance's demand for justice into controllable institutions. But he also needed to satisfy genuine popular anger without destroying the social fabric. Too lenient a purge would leave collaborators in positions of power, delegitimizing the new republic. Too harsh would create so many enemies that France would be ungovernable. By September 1944, the legal machinery began operating. Commissions examined cases. Prosecutors prepared indictments. Judges were appointed. The épuration légale, the legal purge, had begun. The transition from wild to legal purge was neither clean nor complete. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, both systems operated simultaneously. Resistors continued executing suspected collaborators even as courts opened. Some regions, particularly in the south where communist resistance was strongest, resisted submitting to state authority. De Gaulle addressed this challenge directly in a speech at Lyon in October 1944: "Justice must be done. But it must be done by the state, according to law." The spontaneous actions of the liberation were understandable in the heat of battle. But France is now liberated. We are at peace on our soil. Therefore, justice must proceed through legal channels, not through revolutionary tribunals or summary execution. This speech marked a deliberate effort to reassert state authority over revolutionary justice. It was also a signal to the Allies, particularly the Americans, that France was capable of governing itself as a modern democracy, not a revolutionary regime. The establishment of legal process created new dilemmas. What evidence would courts accept? How could prosecutors prove 4-year-old acts of collaboration? What about defendants who claimed they had secretly helped the resistance while appearing to collaborate? How could intent be judged? The sheer scale was overwhelming. Preliminary estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of potential cases. Every denunciation had to be investigated. Every accused person was entitled, theoretically, to defense. The legal system, weakened by 4 years of war and occupation, was utterly unprepared for this tsunami of cases. To manage the volume, authorities created a triage system. The most serious cases, those involving active cooperation with German atrocities or significant harm to the resistance, would be prosecuted first. Lesser cases of indignant national would follow. Minor offences might be quietly dropped. This pragmatic approach, however necessary, created its own injustices. A factory owner who had profited immensely from German contracts might face trial quickly, while his foreman, who had simply followed orders, languished in detention for months awaiting proceedings. A wealthy Parisian who had socialized with German officers might hire skilled lawyers and delay trial, while a rural mayor who had merely implemented Vichy agricultural policies was swiftly convicted. The courts were left to navigate the grey zone, case by case, trying to distinguish between survival and complicity, between accommodation and active collaboration, between following orders and embracing the ideology behind them. By early 1945, the full scope of the legal purge became apparent. The number staggered comprehension: approximately 300,000 investigations. This meant that roughly 1 in every 140 French citizens faced some level of scrutiny for collaboration. Think about what that number means. Not 300,000 fascist ideologues. Not 300,000 Gestapo collaborators. But 300,000 ordinary French citizens who had made choices, large and small, during 4 years of occupation. The vast majority fell into the grey zone. The 3-tiered court system worked to process this massive caseload. The High Court, established specifically to try Vichy's leadership, handled fewer than 100 cases. The courts of justice processed thousands of serious collaborators. But the civic courts, dealing with indignant national, bore the heaviest burden, processing tens of thousands of lesser cases. The courtrooms became theatres where France wrestled with impossible questions. Each trial forced examination of what constituted collaboration, what was survival, and what was resistance. The answers were rarely simple. Consider the case of a factory owner in Lyon. He had maintained production throughout the occupation, fulfilling German contracts for vehicle parts. At trial, prosecutors argued he had willingly enriched himself through collaboration, pointing to his substantial wartime profits and his cordial relationships with German procurement officers. His defense presented a different narrative. By keeping the factory operating under German contracts, he had prevented German authorities from seizing the facility entirely and deporting his workers to forced labor in Germany. He had employed known resistance members, providing them cover, income, and access to materials. He had sabotaged some production runs, ensuring defective goods reached German forces. His profits, he claimed, had partly funded resistance activities. The court faced an impossible question: was he a collaborator or a resistor? Both descriptions fit different aspects of his conduct. Witnesses testified both for and against him. Former workers praised him for protecting them from deportation. Resistance members confirmed receiving funds. But German records showed enthusiastic compliance with quotas and zero documented resistance. After weeks of testimony, he was convicted of collaboration but received a relatively light sentence of 5 years. The verdict suggested the court acknowledged the ambiguity. He had collaborated, yes. But he had also operated within constraints that made pure resistance potentially fatal to hundreds of workers. Such ambiguity characterized countless cases. A police officer who had arrested black marketeers and thieves, maintaining order, but who had also, under direct orders, arrested 3 resistors. Was his primary role law enforcement or collaboration? Should he be judged by the arrests he made voluntarily or the ones he was ordered to make? A journalist who had published pro-Vichy articles in a collaborationist newspaper but had also secretly helped print underground resistance newspapers, using his official position to obtain paper and supplies. Was he a collaborator providing propaganda to the regime, or a resistor using his position for subterfuge? A mayor who had implemented Vichy's anti-Semitic census requirements, dutifully recording Jewish residents in his commune, but who had also hidden 2 Jewish families in the town hall cellar and forged documents for others. Did his public compliance make him a collaborator even if his secret actions saved lives? These were not abstract philosophical questions. These were real cases, with real people facing real consequences. The courts had to draw lines, make judgments, impose sentences. But the lines were rarely clear. Many defendants claimed they had been forced to collaborate under duress. This defense was sometimes legitimate. A civil servant who processed documents under threat of dismissal or arrest faced genuine coercion. But where did legitimate coercion end and voluntary cooperation begin? When did keeping your job become collaboration? The purge also attempted to address economic collaboration. A special focus fell on traffiquants, black market profiteers who had grown wealthy through illegal trade with Germans. Public anger toward these individuals was intense. While ordinary French citizens starved on rations, black marketeers had dined on confiscated food, sold at exorbitant prices. Yet even here, the grey zone complicated prosecution. Some black marketeers had traded with Germans but had also supplied resistance networks. Some had charged exorbitant prices but had also kept people from starving when official rations failed. Some had grown wealthy but had also employed workers who would otherwise have faced deportation. The treatment of women in the legal purge stood in stark contrast to the wild purge's public humiliations. Few women faced formal prosecution. Those who did were typically accused of specific acts like denunciation, not merely romantic relationships with Germans. The legal system, despite its flaws, maintained a distinction between actual collaboration and the gendered punishment that had characterized the head shaving. This discrepancy revealed uncomfortable truths. The public shaming of women had never been about justice, but about symbolic purification and patriarchal control. When courts applied actual legal standards, most women accused of horizontal collaboration faced no charges. They had committed no crime under either Vichy or Republican law. The legal system found almost nothing to prosecute in these women, confirming a horrible truth: the épuration sauvage against them was never about justice for treason. It was misogynistic, symbolic violence designed to repair the French male ego and cleanse the image of the nation. The courts, in their silence, quietly acknowledged the profound injustice done to these 20,000 women. For those women who had endured public humiliation, the legal purge brought no vindication. Their names remained associated with collaboration. Many never recovered psychologically or socially from the stigma. A woman whose head had been shaved in Toulouse recalled decades later, they never apologized. The men who did this to me walked free, righteous in their victory. I spent years unable to look at myself in a mirror. My children learned about it at school, mocked by classmates. That day in the square destroyed my life more completely than any German ever did. While the civic courts processed tens of thousands of grey zone cases, the higher courts addressed questions that would define the purge's meaning. These trials can be understood not as individual prosecutions, but as three fundamental questions about responsibility in times of moral crisis. The trial that would define the épuration légale opened on July 23, 1945, in the Palais de Justice in Paris. In the dock sat Marshal Philippe Pétain, 89 years old, hero of Verdun, the man who had been, for 4 years, the face of Vichy France. The High Court convened with elaborate ceremony. 3 magistrates and 24 jurors, all chosen from resistance backgrounds, would decide Pétain's fate. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and survivors of Vichy's persecutions. Outside, crowds gathered, divided between those demanding Pétain's execution and those still loyal to the marshal. The prosecution's case centered on a single question: had Pétain protected France or betrayed it? Attorney General André Mornet presented devastating evidence. Documents bearing Pétain's signature authorizing deportations. Records of meetings where he approved collaboration measures. His own speeches praising partnership with Germany. Testimony from resistance members who had been tortured by Vichy's milice. Most damning were revelations about the deportation of Jews. In 1942, Nazi authorities had demanded France hand over foreign Jews from the unoccupied zone. Pétain's government not only complied but exceeded quotas, including French Jewish children in deportation convoys. Pierre Laval, Pétain's prime minister, had infamously stated, "These children must not remain in France. They belong with their parents." Mornet's summation captured the prosecution's position: this man claims he was a shield protecting France. In truth, he was a sword wielded by Germany against the French people. He gave legitimacy to occupation. He gave France's resources to our enemies. He sent our citizens to forced labor. He handed over refugees to the Gestapo. If this is not treason, what is? The defense, led by Jacques Eyssonay, attempted to present Pétain as a tragic figure who had sacrificed his reputation to save France from worse fate. Eyssonay argued that Pétain's armistice had prevented France from becoming another Poland, completely occupied and subjected to direct German military rule. He could be both, Eyssonay argued. A shield against German demands while simultaneously a sword against internal enemies. That behind the scenes, Pétain had protected many from German demands, slow-walked orders, preserved French administrative structures that later facilitated liberation. The defense called witnesses testifying that Pétain had quietly aided resistors, had resisted German pressure, had preserved French sovereignty however limited. They presented Pétain as an old man manipulated by more sinister figures like Laval. Pétain himself remained mostly silent throughout the trial. He read a brief statement at the opening: "It is the French people who, through their representatives, gave me power. It is only to the French people that I owe an accounting. I will not respond to an illegitimate court. My life matters little. What matters is France." After this declaration, he sat impassive, occasionally dozing during testimony. His silence was both strategic and symptomatic. Strategic because engagement would legitimate a court his lawyers claimed was illegal. Symptomatic because at 89, showing signs of senility, he seemed only partly aware of proceedings. The trial lasted 3 weeks. One particularly powerful moment came when a woman testified about her husband's deportation. The police who came for him were French. They spoke French. They served a French marshal. When my husband asked why, they said they were following Marshal Pétain's orders. Do not tell me now that Pétain protected us. On August 15, after deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty of intelligence with the enemy. Guilty of collaboration. The sentence, death by firing squad, plus degradation national, stripping of all ranks, honors, and military distinctions. The sentence included a recommendation for clemency due to Pétain's age. Charles de Gaulle, who held the power to commute, faced immense pressure. The resistance demanded execution. Conservative politicians urged clemency. De Gaulle commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment, citing Pétain's advanced age and his service at Verdun. This decision satisfied neither side completely but maintained a careful balance. Justice was seen to be done through conviction, but the Republic demonstrated mercy. Pétain was imprisoned at Fort du Portelet, later transferred to Isle d'Eu. He died in prison on July 23, 1951, 6 years to the day after his trial began, aged 95. The answer to the question of whether a leader could be both shield and sword was decisive: no. Whatever protections Pétain may have provided could not excuse the betrayals he committed. Political responsibility at the highest level admitted no grey zone. While Pétain received clemency from execution, his Prime Minister Pierre Laval faced a different fate. Laval had been the driving force behind Vichy's most collaborative policies. At a meeting in 1942, he had famously stated, "I desire the victory of Germany, because without it, Bolshevism will install itself everywhere." Laval's trial was brief, just 2 weeks. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on all counts, death by firing squad. What followed became one of the most macabre episodes of the purge. Hours before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1945, Laval attempted suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule. Doctors revived him specifically to be executed. At 12:35 p.m., the firing squad's volley rang out. Laval fell. The execution was botched. An officer had to administer the coup de grâce. But if Laval represented action, Robert Brasillach represented words. Brasillach, a prominent fascist intellectual and journalist, was tried in January 1945 for his vitriolic anti-Semitic articles. He had called for the death of Jews and celebrated German victories. He had written, "We must separate ourselves from the Jews en bloc and not keep any small children." His trial forced France to confront whether intellectual responsibility could constitute treason. Could words kill? The prosecution argued yes. Brasillach's articles had created an atmosphere that made deportations psychologically acceptable. His words had encouraged denunciations. His celebration of anti-Semitic measures had provided ideological cover for murder. The defense countered that Brasillach was a writer, not an executioner. That France had always prided itself on freedom of thought, even dangerous thought. That prosecuting intellectuals for their ideas, however repugnant, was a step toward totalitarianism. A petition for clemency was signed by prominent writers including Albert Camus and François Mauriac, who despite loathing Brasillach's ideas, feared the precedent of executing writers for their words. De Gaulle refused to commute the sentence. Brasillach was executed by firing squad on February 6, 1945. The answer was clear: when words directly endangered lives, when intellectual work provided the framework for atrocity, words could indeed constitute treason. Charles Maurras, another prominent intellectual and founder of Action Française, was tried for collaboration. At 76, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and degradation national. When the verdict was announced, Maurras shouted, "It is the revenge of Dreyfus," connecting his punishment to the anti-Semitic campaign he had led decades earlier. After the liberation, France faced a haunting question: could wealth earned through collaboration be punished, even if no specific crime could be proven? Louis Renault, the famed carmaker, symbolized this dilemma. His factories had produced vehicles for the Germans. Arrested in 1944, he died in prison before trial, officially of natural causes, though rumors of mistreatment persisted. His company was nationalized as punishment, one of the most visible acts of economic justice. Yet Renault was the exception. Most industrialists escaped serious punishment. France needed factories to rebuild. Owners claimed they'd acted under duress, sabotaged production, or protected workers from deportation. A 1945 law ordered confiscation of profits made through commerce with the enemy. Special commissions were created to investigate, but results were meager. Records were missing, falsified, or destroyed. Connections mattered more than guilt. Out of an estimated 500 billion francs in wartime profits, fewer than 20 billion were recovered. Wealth insulated the guilty. Ordinary people saw it plainly: the rich escaped, while the poor paid. The purge moral question, could money taint the Republic, received an ambiguous answer: technically yes, but legally no. By 1946, France was exhausted. The major trials were over, the war was turning into the Cold War, and the mood had shifted from vengeance to reconstruction. Of 300,000 investigations, 127,000 went to trial. 6,700 death sentences were issued, though most were commuted. About 38,000 prison sentences and 49,000 degradations of civic rights followed. Then came amnesty. The first, in 1947, restored rights to minor offenders, around 40,000 people. In 1951, another 62,000 benefited as most cases of indignant national were wiped away. By 1953, nearly all collaboration offences except murder and torture were pardoned. Resistance veterans were outraged. "Our comrades died for justice," one wrote bitterly, "and their murderers now return to their homes." Jewish survivors, too, saw justice undone as those who aided deportations resumed normal lives. But for others, amnesty was a necessity. France could not remain at war with itself forever. A popular newspaper argued, "The great criminals have been punished. Must we keep punishing the small?" This new leniency fit a broader narrative taking shape. The Gaullist myth recast France as a nation of resistors. Vichy became an aberration, an episode inflicted on France, not one carried out by it. The myth comforted the nation, but it wasn't true. Historians would later estimate that only 2 to 3% of French actively resisted. Most simply adapted. Punishing everyone implicated in Vichy would have meant condemning millions. So France chose selective memory, punishing a few, reintegrating the rest. The case of Maurice Papin embodied this moral compromise. As a police official in Bordeaux, he oversaw deportations of Jews. Yet he went unpunished, later becoming Paris police chief and even a government minister. His crimes surfaced only in the 1980s, and he was convicted in 1998, half a century late. The Papin affair revealed what the épuration légale had left unfinished: France had moved on, but justice had not. For decades, France lived under a comforting illusion: most had resisted, collaboration was marginal, and the nation had redeemed itself. That illusion shattered in the 1970s. In 1971, Marcel Arfoul's documentary The Sorrow and the Pity exposed ordinary French citizens speaking openly about collaboration, indifference, and anti-Semitism. The film was banned from TV for 10 years but ignited debate when finally broadcast. 2 years later, Robert Paxton's Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order demolished the resistance myth. Using German archives, Paxton showed that Vichy's collaboration was not coerced, it was voluntary and often enthusiastic. Historian Henry Rousseau later called this the Vichy syndrome, a cycle of repression and return. France first purged, then forgot, then was forced to remember. The 1980s and 1990s reopened the wounds. The Klaus Barbie trial forced France to confront its complicity. The Papin trial decades later symbolized a long-delayed reckoning. Then, in 1995, President Jacques Chirac broke with decades of denial. At a memorial for the Vel d'Hiv roundup, he declared, "France, homeland of human rights, on that day committed the irreparable. It delivered those under its protection to their executioners." For the first time, the French state officially acknowledged its responsibility for deporting Jews. By the century's end, the resistance myth was gone. Museums, memorials, and films now told a more complex story of courage, compromise, and complicity. But the debates never truly ended. Each generation revisited the past through new questions of identity, guilt, and justice. France's purge stood between extremes. Belgium and Norway's purges were harsher. Italy and Austria's, far milder. Germany began with strict denazification, then quickly abandoned it as Cold War politics demanded stability. Like its neighbors, France began with fury and ended with amnesty. But its memory wars were uniquely intense, perhaps because France's republican ideals made collaboration with fascism feel like a deeper betrayal. The result was a moral middle ground, not total vengeance, not total amnesia, just enough punishment to claim justice, and enough forgiveness to rebuild. The impossible justice. The epuration was France's attempt to do the impossible, deliver justice for mass complicity. It was necessary. Vichy had deported Jews, hunted resistors, and collaborated willingly. But it was also doomed. Too many had participated in some way. Total justice would have destroyed the nation itself. The purge failures revealed its paradoxes. Economic justice collapsed under wealth and influence. Gendered violence targeted women as scapegoats while powerful men escaped. Amnesty replaced vengeance, not out of mercy but out of political need. Memory shifted from denial to obsession, proving that the past cannot be legislated away. Ultimately, France's post-war justice became a mirror, reflecting not only what the nation had done, but what it wanted to believe about itself. Epilogue: the photographs remember. A woman in a town square, her head shaved by a jeering crowd, one of the femmes tendues. That photograph, repeated across France in 1944, became the symbol of liberation's fury. It captures a single moment: rage, shame, vengeance. But it cannot show what followed: the decades of silence, the amnesties, the forgetting. The epuration légale, with its trials and statistics, was an attempt to replace revenge with law. But the numbers: 300,000 investigated, 127,000 tried, fewer than 800 executed, tell only part of the story. The rest lies in that grey zone where collaboration, survival, and guilt blur together. France's purge was imperfect, incomplete, and indispensable. It allowed a wounded republic to rebuild while forcing future generations to ask what justice means when an entire society has been complicit. The photographs still ask that question. Would we have acted differently? Would we have chosen justice or survival? And when the war ended, would we have remembered or preferred to forget?